Back inside here on the Sports on Tap on the Carolina Sports Network, we're talking with the executive director of the NASCAR Hall of Fame and MRN's lead pit reporter, Winston Kelley. Winston, how you doing this morning?
I'm doing outstanding. Appreciate you having us on.
Oh, thank you very much. I guess since you're the executive director of the NASCAR Hall of Fame, we'll start with the first question. Can you tell us a little bit about the idea of how the induction process works to get into the NASCAR Hall of Fame?
Absolutely. NASCAR came up with what I think is an outstanding process back in 2009 and has slightly revised it for 2014, which is there's a nominating committee made up of 22 people that are longtime industry folks who have been involved 30 plus years for every single one of them, and we get together and discuss the different people who are eligible, and that's anybody who has participated and contributed to the industry for at least 10 years. Drivers would need to be retired within by 3 years or have reached age 55. So we get together in February, discuss and debate the potential candidates, and then we do our own ballot, submit it to an accounting firm, and the top 20 are identified to go on a larger ballot, not to go on the full ballot. Then there is a fan vote. The only Hall of Fame anywhere that has a fan that have an element, they can vote on NASCAR.com or NASCARHall.com. That happens for about a month. And the top 5 vote getters get one vote that goes toward the selection. Then there is a voting panel that meets in May. There's 54 of us that get together and have that same discussion and debate about those 20 candidates. And those 20, the top 5 vote getters from that process are selected and announced that day.
Is there ever a situation that you could see where there may not be, I mean, I guess it makes sense, but would there ever be a situation where you may not see 5 guys get in?
Well, what NASCAR determined, and I personally agree with it, that 5 was the right amount for our initial phases. And what they've said is after 10 years, which would be 5 more years, then they'll step back and look at it to see if 5 remains the right number. So is it theoretically possible that there could be a different number? Absolutely. But between now and the next 5 years into 2019, we'll continue to have 5 that go in each year.
When the NASCAR Hall of Fame originally came about, the original voting process took, well, I guess the original inauguration ceremony took place in May. It's been pushed back to January now. Was there any kind of negative criticism at that time when you guys pushed it from May to January, or has it all been positive?
No, it was actually all positive. And what we realized, we wanted to start in May and do it around race week, and we were scheduled to open in May of 2010. So that made sense. We wanted to induct the class as soon as we opened. But what we quickly realized is there was so much going on in the month of May in Charlotte that we wanted to have a standalone weekend that focused on these very deserving NASCAR Hall of Famers. And actually, NASCAR has built a broader week around the NASCAR Hall of Fame induction ceremony and combine that with the Charlotte Motor Speedway's media tour, some other events that NASCAR has done on the business side, and also done a NASCAR Fan Day to add to it. So it actually, rather than having 3 weekends that race fans can come to Charlotte for the All-Star race, the Coca-Cola 600, Bank of America 500, you also have induction weekend. It also gives fans an opportunity leading into the NASCAR season to basically kick it off with the Hall of Fame ceremony while we're all looking for something NASCAR related. So the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive within the industry and from the fan base.
Considering that Charlotte, North Carolina is probably considered the home of NASCAR in North Carolina in general, and you being the executive director of NASCAR, how often do you ever hear people say to you that the Hall of Fame should have been located somewhere else outside of North Carolina?
Maybe once a year from somebody who is from one of those remote locations. When you talk to our race fans and the folks that come here and visit, and when I talk to race fans all over the country, which I have the pleasure of doing, working with Motor Racing Network, I don't ever hear a race fan say it should have gone anywhere else. You may have somebody with a perspective from their particular market that would have liked to have seen it there, but I have never heard one race fan say it should be anywhere else from Charlotte.
Yeah, I'm sure Daytona's thrown out there a lot. Probably that's the only thing that I could say would be different. A big name NASCAR right now is Wendell Scott is part of the 2015 class. What does the name Wendell Scott mean to you as far as the sport of NASCAR goes?
I think his legacy is incredible, and I think one of the ways that I would describe it to people, and Junior Johnson made this point when we were working on the first couple of classes, what people need to look at is what people did for the sport, not just what they did in the sport. And what Wendell Scott did for the sport by overcoming the obstacles that he overcame, and how that legacy has started to build, especially with NASCAR's Drive for Diversity program that people like Kyle Larson and Bubba Wallace have been a part of, that he's really a trailblazer. He's our Jackie Robinson, if you will. And if you look at, some people think, well, his numbers were not as great as somebody else. Well, Jackie Robinson's numbers were not huge in terms of batting average and home runs and things like that. But he was a true trailblazer that did more with less than anybody I can imagine, and the emotional connection that people like Bubba Wallace have back to him and what he did for the sport is just phenomenal.
With the ceremony that night, I'm thinking, I envision like the way the NBA Hall of Fame goes and the NFL Hall of Fame goes. What particular order do you guys induct them in?
Well, we generally just look at it and try to space them out with with living inductees and folks who are deceased. That you don't want to do, all your deceased or living up front. So it's typically been spread out based on that. We typically the last recipient is typically one of our living inductees, and we've had a minimum of two. Our first class we had two living inductees. Most classes we have had 3 or 4 living inductees, so it's typically spread out in that fashion.
Is it safe to say that Bill Elliott's going to go last?
Actually, I haven't talked to NASCAR about that. We haven't gotten that far in the process. I think that's certainly not a bad assumption when you look at the potential folks. We've got Fred Lorenzen, who is still living, but he's not been as healthy. Rex White. Last year we had Dale Jarrett go last, and part of that was because we had a very unique inductor in Blake Shelton, country music superstar, who's a good personal friend of his. So you also look at things like that. So, while we haven't gotten that far, that's probably not a bad bet that Bill Elliott could be kind of the culmination and the exclamation point. We haven't always done it, by who's living going last, because the first year we had Dale Earnhardt go last.
Oh, of course.
We did Bill France Sr. first. We felt like that would be appropriate since he started the sport to go in first. And then we felt like Richard Petty going in next as arguably the biggest name that's ever participated in competition going in second. But then you have your exclamation point at the end with Dale Earnhardt going in last and his family being up there. So, there's no cookie cutter approach, if you will. All of them are equal. So you could really put them in a bucket and pull them out and be justified in how they came out. But typically you want your one that's last to be somebody that the audience, both there and watching on television, I'm looking forward to that one just as much as the first one.
Before we get into a little NASCAR talk, just for the season goes, looking into the Hall of Fame, who hasn't been inducted yet that surprises you and you see in the very near future?
I don't know that anybody surprises me, and here's why. I think the panel has done a great job in coming up with balance. And what I say balance, I mean pioneers, the people who started the sport and were part of that foundation in the 1940s and the 1950s, and as it evolved into the 60s. The different types of people, not just your superstar Sprint Cup drivers, but those who work behind the scenes, whether it's the Glenn Woods and Leonard Woods and Bud Moores, crew chief, a nationwide series, what was the Busch series in Jack Ingram, a modified driver in Richie Evans. So I think the panel has done an exceptional job in getting that balance, and I think we'll continue to see that. So there's nobody out there that I say, I'm scratching my head, because if I would take somebody and say they should have gone in earlier, there's nobody on the list that I can say shouldn't have already gone in. So it's just a right prioritization and cadence, and there's not a menu of how to do that. So there's nobody out there that I'm scratching my head and say, no, I don't get that. I think all 30 are very, very deserving, but there's another 30 or 40 on the list that are equally deserving.
We're talking with Winston Kelley, Executive Director of NASCAR Hall of Fame and MRN's lead pit reporter. Covering sports, I've done everything from being on the sideline of college football games, being on the sideline of NFL games, being at basketball games. One thing I've never done is been at a NASCAR track, let alone be down in the pit area. You're the lead pit reporter for MRN. What is it like? Just kind of give our listeners and fans an idea of what it's like to be around those cars.
Well, the cars themselves and the pit crews and the energy that comes at a NASCAR race is something that I cannot adequately describe. It's something that you've got to experience, and that's one of the things that we constantly hear from fans who go to a race for the first time and say, wow, now I understand. Television absolutely does not do it justice. And the TV folks do a fantastic job in covering the sport, don't get me wrong, and I think we do a pretty solid job on radio, but fans will say this experience, the energy, far exceeds anything that I would have expected.
You look at the chase this year and you see Dale Jr., he's sitting fifth in points. I remember when he won his the Daytona 500 back in 2004. I was actually at that Daytona 500, and he sits in fifth. I mean, he's one of the hot hands considered to win this year. If he wins this year, how drastically does this change Junior's legacy in driving?
I think it just adds another huge element to it. I think he's got an exceptional legacy already. Has won, 20 plus races. I think he's somewhere in the, 24, 25 races that he's won. He won 2 NASCAR, what is now Nationwide Series championships. And, there are people who are going to go into the NASCAR Hall of Fame and have gone into the NASCAR Hall of Fame that don't have Premier Series championships. Mark Martin comes to mind. I don't know when he's going to go in, but I'm very confident that Mark Martin will go into the NASCAR Hall of Fame. Had the record for the most Busch Series wins, what is now the Nationwide Series, for a number of years. Didn't win a championship there. Dale Jr. won 2 championships. And I also don't believe just because you've won a Cup championship without the rest of the resume that you automatically get in the NASCAR Hall of Fame. So, I'm not going to go out on a limb and say he's had a Hall of Fame career, but his numbers are consistent with folks who are being talked about. So I think it just adds an exclamation point to what has been a very good career.
I know you've been around NASCAR for a while, whether it was working for the pit reporters or just growing up in the family of NASCAR. But what is it? You've seen the points change and how it's done, and now you have the chase for the race for the chase. You have all this stuff now going on in NASCAR. Do you think the point system now is better now, or was it better, say 10 years ago?
I think it's better now, and I'll explain why. When it was changed in 2004, I was a traditionalist. I'd been around the sport, at that time for about 40 years. I went to my first race in 1964. I wasn't all that excited about the change. I like how it had been done. When we got to August, I realized how wrong I was, because in August of 2004, there was a reasonable separation between the leader and others, and we had so much as race fans to watch and so much as member of the media to cover going into the transfer race at Richmond. And then we only had 10 drivers that would go in. We were talking about where the 7th, 8th, 12th, 13th place driver was, and the fact that they still had a chance to legitimately win the championship. And I think that was a great transition. And now to have an added emphasis on wins in addition to the consistency of points, I think this system is phenomenal. I think how it is played out on the racetrack in competition and how it's going to play out with 3 different transfer races, if you will, coming up with Dover and Talladega, Dover and Phoenix and the other transfer race that we'll have. I think it's going to be Talladega. It's just going to be phenomenal as a race fan to see. People still have an opportunity to get in. Ryan Newman, Eric Almirola, Greg Biffle had some troubles this past weekend. They could go to Dover. They could go this weekend in New Hampshire, places where they've run well, and win and get in.
Do you think that the way the playoff system is set up, that it hurts some people with, I guess, with the tracks that are in the race or in the chase? Does it matter, like, whereas Daytona doesn't necessarily is not in there?
Yeah, I think you're always going to have tracks that some people run better. But if you look at it and you look at, just take this first three races, you've got an intermediate 1.5 mile track. You've got a flat track in New Hampshire that's just a little bit over a mile. And then you've got a high bank, higher speed 1 mile track in Dover. Three very different tracks. And, let's take Ryan Newman and Greg Biffle as examples. Ryan has historically run much better than Greg on the flatter tracks, New Hampshire. I don't have his wins committed to memory. He's probably got a better chance there than Greg does. Greg's probably got a better chance and a better history at Dover. So everybody has opportunities to win. Some are more consistent over the entire 10 races. Jimmy Johnson has shown that over the years. So if somebody has an advantage, it's generally because they're better or their team is better at that point in time or has more consistency. But I think the diversity of tracks gives everybody the opportunity. And it's just like stick and ball sports. If you didn't make it into the playoffs, you didn't have a good 162 games or a good 16 games in football. You don't deserve to be in there. But the last seeded team has an opportunity to win the Super Bowl, to win the World Series, just like a lower seeded team does in the NCAA.
Yeah, I definitely like the way it's set up now, because I remember, I guess it was 2003, whoever won that year 2003, they didn't even win a single race all.
Actually, it was Matt Kenseth, and he won one race.
Okay, one race. So that goes back to your point, though, yeah.
And that was a large part of why Brian France and the team made the change. And no disrespect to Matt Kenseth, who has been a perennial chase contender, won 7 races last year, so he can win races. But to make sure that it's not just based on somebody that always has top 5 finishes. And I think the change this year to have an added element to winning races, and consistency still matters, because we had 3 guys that got into the chase. Ryan Newman, Greg Biffle, among those who got in because of consistency. Then you had other guys like Eric Almirola and Kurt Busch that didn't have the consistency, but they won races. And again, on very different tracks. Daytona for Eric, and Martinsville, our shortest track, for Kurt Busch. So, if you're going to make the chase, you're going to have to be good at multiple tracks.
You got Brad Keselowski sitting at number 1. I'd mentioned Junior's 5th in the points right now. You got a couple other Hendrick boys in there as far as Gordon and Jimmy Johnson goes. Who's your prediction to win this whole thing, if you had to throw a name out there?
I would have to say there's about 5 guys that I would put in the mix. I think it's going to come down, maybe 6 guys. I think it's going to come down to one of the Penske drivers, Brad or Joey Logano, from the Hendrick camp, either Dale Jr., Jeff Gordon, or Jimmy Johnson. Or if it's going to come from outside of that camp, the team that has had the most speed has been Kevin Harvick, and they've got Hendrick Motors. So I'd say those 6 would be who I would have. And when I filled out my initial chase grid, trying to, those 6 I had easily going through all the rounds and then trying to get it down to the 1. But I'd take any one of those 6, put them in a hat, pull that name out, and I'd feel good about that if you and I wanted to bet a cheeseburger and a Coke on who would win.
We're talking Winston Kelley, Executive Director of NASCAR Hall of Fame and MRN's lead pit reporter. The last thing before we get you out of here, we always ask all our guests for a last call. The way the last call works is it's a shout out to something in sports. It doesn't have to be sports. It could be something in your personal life as well. But Winston Kelley, what would be your last call today?
My shout out would be to Richard Petty, and I'll tell you why. Because it's because of Richard Petty and people like him that we get to do what we do. Had a great experience this week that there was a gentleman and his family here in the NASCAR Hall of Fame. He's got incurable cancer, and he had a bucket list. His bucket list was to go with some of his family from Indiana to visit a daughter that didn't live there in Texas. go to Richard Petty's museum, personally meet Richard, hand him a check, a very sizable check for the Victory Junction camp, and come to the NASCAR Hall of Fame. And for us to be on his bucket list, that was quite the honor. But Richard personally pushed this gentleman around his museum, I'm told for about an hour, showed him around, took him on a personal ride, and graciously accepted his gift to help kids who are less fortunate. So, people like Richard Petty have set the standard for us in servicing our customers and our fans. So my shout out would be to Richard Petty and all the fans like George Mason and his family who came and visited us that support NASCAR racing.
That is very cool. The one thing about NASCAR is, on the flip side, is you don't hear a lot of negative things, but also on the other side is you don't hear all the positive things that everybody does for NASCAR. So that's very cool. Winston Kelley, Executive Director of NASCAR Hall of Fame and MRN's lead pit reporter. Hopefully we can catch up with you before the season ends.
I would love to, Lee. Appreciate you having us on.